anytime when somebody says AI is crap. So there will be no delving into anything in this talk. Now I've titled my talk AppSec Rules Agile. Who knows what AppSec is? Okay. It stands for Application Security. So if security is not your bag, if you don't think it's agile, you don't have to stay here. I've instructed, I have a good relationship with security, they haven't locked the door. Honest, you can escape. Now in my LinkedIn profile, I titled myself as an AppSec snooper and an agile fundamentalist. And I thought, I'll bring those together for a nice little talk. Now, AppSec, I have had some experience. I've run application security program for the UK's premier tax collection agency, HMRC. I haven't shaved my beard off, so that's why I don't quite look like my avatar. But despite my young-looking exterior, I have got quite a lot of years of experience. I started out as a developer. I've sort of worked with a lot of different places, big, some small, some agile, some less so. And then I sort of pivoted into application security because I essentially kept finding fun stuff. It all started when I found a commented out line in a configuration file that meant that a payload wasn't encrypted, which meant that I could inject my own commands into an interaction. Now, don't worry, it won't get technical. I want to talk about why security, application security specifically, is actually an agile thing to do. And also, it's not something that you can only use in like modern pipelines. It applies to legacy as well as it does to anything. And the way you do it makes a lot of sense. Now, let's start this talk with Harry. Harry is my son. He loves jigsaws. He starts school in September. And this was a photo from his play and stay, which happened yesterday, which gave me a bit of a problem because I needed to come down here to Cornwall, but I wanted to do it. Now, I had a look at the trains, and yes, 4 changes to come down from the northwest of England with 10 minutes stops. I don't know, I don't quite trust the British rail network to get me here on time. I know that in Japan, you get a personal letter of apology if the train is a minute late. I was in Holland the other day and they told me that they consider the German rail system so inefficient. And I was thinking, if the German rail system is inefficient, have they come over here? I don't know. Anyway, I promised AppSec and Agile. And what does my journey down here in my car, where I hoped that the clutch wouldn't give out because the other day it stopped working and I could only change gear when I switched it off. What has that got to do with Agile? Well, maybe it's a good metaphor. Sometimes you have to look at how things work, how are things going before you can sort of really continue. Now, it's about a year ago that we had that McKinsey article. For those who don't know, the McKinsey consultancy published an article about measuring developer productivity. It was widely rubbished as being something ridiculous. There were articles and rebuttals by Kent Beck, Dave Farley, did a good one. My personal favorite is Dan North's, which if you get a chance, read it because I quite liked it. The thing that triggered me about it was that it had this lovely little image where it describes development as something where there's an inner loop where you code and build and test, and then have an outer loop where you deploy and have meetings and integrate, and oh, we need to stick security in there somewhere. And what got me was that they were sort of saying you have to maximize the inner loop, get people to write code as quickly as possible and minimize the outer loop. And I thought, well, surely that's not right. I mean, do you really want to only consider sort of security and compliance right at the end of at the end of your process? Security is more than an afterthought. I mean, who here, show of hands, has had to deal with a pen test that was done 2 weeks before you released your software? Okay, that is normal. Now let's be realistic. Who here had to deal with a pen test that was done 2 weeks after you released your software and then found lots of things, and then you kind of go, oh, well, we maybe have to accept this as a risk for now, and I know we've found lots of wrong, but let's have our fingers crossed and nothing will happen. Now, when I started my sort of journey as a developer, this is the picture I've had of security. Somebody who lives in their ivory tower, hoards all the secret information, and occasionally comes down with decrees on why you can't do something and why you don't get to release this time, because in their security assessment that helpfully happens 2 weeks before release, they found some issues. And the old ivory tower analogy. Now, it also works the other way around. This is something that has happened to me very recently, where I was in a meeting and the head of security was told, right, we now need an assessment about security about this for this particular project. And he was screaming, well, why did nobody tell me about it? When we work in silos, as we still often do, I know we're at an Agile conference, I know that, but we have to be realistic. Sometimes Agile is this, the Agile Scrum fall. And to make things worse for security is, like we discussed, is somewhere over here. And it doesn't help that usually developers and security sort of just think of each other as the enemy. I mean, I've had plenty of time when I wanted to do something and then security said no, because this particular piece of software is not on our approved list and we would have to do an assessment. And in order to do that assessment, you can raise a ticket and we will get back to you in 6 months' time, we promise, unless there's something else. And conversely, I've also seen the other side where security kind of looks at what developers try to do and sort of, don't they understand? Can't they realize that what they're building is just a bit idiotic? We have policies and procedures for a reason. Somewhere hidden on a Confluence page that nobody ever reads because you can't find anything in Confluence. So that brings me to this little thing. I did say at the beginning that I'm an Agile fundamentalist. And what I mean by that is not somebody who will stuff Scrum down your throat or who will insist that you have all the ceremonies and meetings or tries to sell you an Agile certificate. No, I call myself a fundamentalist because to be honest, I came to this manifesto late in my journey. I was so used to working with Word documents that describe the high-level design and then writing another Word document that is the low-level design and then having endless meetings about it that I accepted it as normal. And it was only after I started working for the premier UK's tax collection agency where I found actually there's another way. We had a project which on the outside looked very, very unappealing. It was take this bit of software out of a data center, lift it, and shift it into the cloud. You think, this is a death's doornail job, isn't it? Nobody would want to do that. And funnily enough, I stuck around 6 years, because not only did we lift it and shift it, we also improved it, we ran it, and this was the project where I found that single commented outline where this caused the whole thing to be insecure. I later found a lot more interesting things, and it gave me that application security career. But the one thing that really impressed me is that when we started this lifting and shifting exercise, we were working out of an office in a cafe. It wasn't an office, it was a co-working space. We had sticky notes. And it was a real joy to sort of say, okay, well, we'll move stuff. We were doing really quick stuff every other week. We sort of moved something else. And that kind of made me read the Agile Software Development Manifesto in a slightly different light. One of the biggest things for me, my favorite thing, is that individuals and interactions over processes and tools. So I'm thinking maybe security and development, application security, can do something similar. The first one, I think I'll just steal verbatim. Individuals and interactions over processes and tools sounds like a good thing to do, even when it comes to security. Now, typically when we talk about application security, we talk about supply chain issues. This is the ship that crashed into the bridge and that shuts down entry and exit into the port. Now, when you think about things like who's heard of the Log4Shell vulnerability? Yes, there are some Christmases ruined, weren't there? Bit of background, a very popular library that was used was found to have a vulnerability that if you put in an input, it can cause a remote code execution vulnerability. And because it was an open source library that was used in lots and lots and lots of places, suddenly everyone in security needed to check, are we affected by it? And then they said, thank God we're not. And then they discovered, have we checked our instance of Jira? Ooh, have we checked the whole supply chain was affected, which is why one little thing can cause a massive, massive problem. Now, the issue with supply chain vulnerabilities is that I think at the moment there are about 86 new CVEs, which is short for common vulnerabilities and exposures, which get raised when there's vulnerabilities, get raised every day. And you can see that it's trending upwards. This is from a guy called Gerald Benischke who keeps track of all this and runs lots of little stats tools to show us how bad it is. What some of you might not know is that at the moment, the National Vulnerability Database that is being run was underfunded for a couple of months and wasn't actually doing anything. So there are about 13,000 vulnerabilities that haven't yet been classified, which means that typically tools don't pick them up if they haven't been classified, because you need to say this vulnerability is this particular score, this vulnerability affects this particular library. If you don't classify it properly, then you don't know where it is. Now let's be honest. Which organization doesn't do this? Which organization doesn't do, all right, we have 5,000 vulnerabilities. We have no way of going through that all because we have so much to do. And we need to release this really, really quickly. Can't we just please, for this one time, disable the pipeline? Which then inevitably happens because somebody accepts the risk. And then you push that critical update out, and then you promise, really, we'll switch it back on, which obviously never happens. And this here, this sort of 5,000 known vulnerabilities in 230 projects. This is from a recent gig, and this is not a big project. It is amazing how many vulnerabilities, how many different dependencies we all got in our software. And obviously, no talk shall go without AI. We have got some vendors that promise us to solve everything by, I have to admit, I used a large language model to make up these quotes, but I think they were quite good, weren't they? Unleash the power of AI, proactive, intelligent, and comprehensive cybersecurity solutions. It says nothing, but still. There is a habit in cybersecurity to have processes and tools over individuals and interactions. So you throw money at a problem so that you can tick a box. Anyway, I want to go back to these vulnerabilities. And a lot of the time, the tools build on something called the CVSS score, which is a nice little mouthful of the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, SCORE. Because who doesn't love an acronym that contains the thing? Anyway, ATM, here we come. My biggest bugbear with the CVSS scores is that they make it sound like it is a continuous score where 0 is the least amount of risk and 10 is the biggest amount of risk. But a while back, I did a bit of an analysis on a project that I was working on and sort of said, well, what are the actual scores? How are they distributed? And I found that down in the low end, there's relatively little. And it was very sort of heavily weighted towards the upper end of the score. And a lot of the time, you kind of end up having things where vulnerability scores get added into policies that says, if you have a vulnerability with a score of 8 or higher, then we'll break the pipeline and you can't build. That's how some of the tool works. Now, the interesting thing is I picked 8 for a reason, because obviously it covers quite a bit. But the interesting thing is that there's a massive graph at 7.5. This is actually to do with how the way the CVSS scoring system works. But basically, unless you get something like remote code execution, which means that you send something and it's very easy for them to execute something on your server, you won't get over 7.5. And there's a huge amount of vulnerabilities that range from being able to kill your server, from eating all its resources, from things that can effectively deny you the use of the infrastructure, that is just classed as 7.5. And if you've got one of those policies that say, yeah, everything on the rate is, we'll accept the risk for it, then are you really secure? What I did do, I looked at a lot of the actual security reports, and I found that the ones in blue, I could see how they could be exploited theoretically. The ones in red were like, well, just reading the report makes me think the context of this vulnerability means that it's never exploitable in the system that you're in. Now, this slide is a very well-known meme. If anybody's ever worked with Node.js, it will make absolute sense. Although, to be fair, it's also quite true if you work in the Java ecosystem. I've done some analysis where there was a simple service, pulled in a couple of dependencies, and before you know it, you had 300 jar files that have been brought in, because a dependency brings in another dependency, brings in another dependency, and all of those dependencies can contain vulnerabilities. So it's no surprise that sort of looking through them all can be quite a problem. The other issue that we've got is that we've got an issue of scale. When we look at systems, we usually have lots of different microservices talking to each other. Now, in the interest to protect the innocent, or clients, as I like to call them as well, this is intentionally sort of zoomed out so you can't really see what's going on. But this is the interaction between different microservices at the Premier tax collection agency. So you can see how many parts talk to each other. And if you sort of say, oh, well, we'll just have a policy of you fix any vulnerability within 48 hours, and we have 300 dependencies, and in these 300 dependencies, we've got tons and tons of vulnerabilities, that's gonna be a massive amount of work. And I don't think you can do that by simply saying, oh, we have a tool and we block our build, and it is hard work. But I took a book out of Agile. This brings us back to the subject of the talk. In this particular thing, I ended up actually having a look at all the vulnerabilities, because when I looked at vulnerabilities to say, are they exploitable or not, I found it was a bit of a mishmash. And it didn't matter about how low the score was. There are vulnerabilities that are classed at 5, which are called regular expression denial of service attacks. But if you've got one of them right, you can kill your service with one request. Nice. So I ended up going back to basics and saying, right, I'm not going to buy a big, massive tool. I'm going to use what I've got. I'm going to put it into spreadsheets. And yes, spreadsheets. It took me 25 years of being a software developer, then doing a bit of security, to realize how brilliant spreadsheets are, particularly pivot tables. It's amazing. You have a list of vulnerabilities in services. You have a pivot table and it tells you, oh, look, this one's got 300, this only got 2, this one's got this. And the amount of raw data that you can process by just stuffing them into a simple spreadsheet is amazing. And once I started sort of going, oh, well, a little basic tool can do something, then I built something else. I used a bit of bash, a bit of JQ to mash things together very quickly. And I had myself a vulnerability curation pipeline where I looked at each and every one of the things. But the key to it really was that you start small. You don't go out to tender for a big security tool. You sort of try to sort of see what information can you get to yourself. And then you iterate. And then at the end, you might well decide that actually I need that big tool in order to help me manage the vulnerabilities. So the next thing that I'd like to do, by the way, I forgot to add this at the beginning. If somebody has any questions, shout them out or leave them to the end. I don't mind. Either way works for me. Interrupt me, distract me. Yes. So my next bit is that the second sort of principle of the Agile Software Manifesto says working software over comprehensive documentation. So I thought, how can I bastardize this? And I thought, secure software over security checklists. Unfortunately, a lot of time, when we look at the way that security works, we end up in a scenario where we go, oh, this regulator tells us we have to tick all these boxes, so we best make sure that we've got some evidence to tick all these boxes. And you do, or you get a pen test report that tells you, yes, you have 2 medium and 1 minor risk. Who's had those before? Whose pen test looks like that? Anybody? Yes, most people. I had one of them, and then I actually had a look and say, ooh, what can I do? And found that I found endpoints that weren't properly protected, which meant that I could look up somebody else's data. And that was after the pen test company had completed their thing. Problem is that pen testing companies often have, you know, the budget is you have 10 services to test, you've got 10 days to do it, and you come in cold. You have got no idea what the technology stack is. You have got no idea what the users are doing. And you just sort of, a lot of the time it ends up people going, oh, I'll just press a few buttons and see what happens. Or more likely, I'll just run Metasploit on it and the automated scanner will tell me what it finds. Or yes, yet another HTTP header that you haven't set. The number of vulnerabilities that get raised by pen testing companies related to HTTP headers that some scanner somewhere says is frustrating, especially when it is an HTTP header that is vulnerability in a browser, but you've given them an API endpoint to test. Just saying. I'm not saying that pen testing companies are bad. There are some really good ones. But the idea that you can get a tick of we've completed a yearly pen test can give you any assurance that you've got secure software is a bit of a myth, I'm sorry to say. Now, at the keynote, David was talking about a snake that eats itself. That's my snake that eats itself. Well, two of them really. This is a picture that I've used to illustrate what I think is a really good way of working together, where security and development teams must not live in isolation. They must talk to each other, because you sometimes hear tropes like, oh, security is everyone's responsibility. What does that mean? It's nobody's responsibility. I don't want to have development teams where every single developer is a security expert, because then they just go and work as security experts. But somehow you also don't want the security team living in that ivory tower and only coming down at the end. So it needs constant collaboration. And I've listed some of them here. The application security team, if you've got one. If you don't, then you probably want to look at somebody that takes on the mantle. Are typically the ones that will understand the system and understand how to read those vulnerability reports, put the two together and say, this is what could be a vulnerability. This you can ignore. My favorite task when working as an application security lead was to listen to somebody say, is this a security problem? And me saying, no, you don't need to bother. It's fine. Nothing gave me more pleasure than to make life simple for developers and saying, no, you're overthinking it. It's fine. This comes under sort of the advice and being able to communicate it. Right, next bit. But I need to prove it to the regulator. Screams the head of security 3 days before the project concludes. Those security frameworks that regulated industry like fintech or government or anything to do with money, or the amount of regulations that we've got and that we have to comply in our industry is quite a lot. And it always will be quite a lot. And I think I'm pretty sure it was last year at this conference when Marcel said that there's about 200 new pieces of regulation that come out every year. So the landscape is changing. The kind of regulations that you do, you can't just go and say, oh, I've done this, tick, and I don't need to do anything anymore for the next 5 years. So in this particular instance, we've recently started, in my job, started sort of looking at the regulations and finding, oh, we haven't got this documented, we haven't got this documented, we haven't got this documented, and we need to do this, and we need to do the next thing, and we need to please the regulator. When our regulation specialist came in and said, actually, you know what? Regulators actually really like Agile and DevOps, and they want to make sure that the spirit of regulation is being met. A lot of the time you can negotiate with regulators. And if you show that you're looking at what is the most pressing thing, then you don't necessarily get hit with the fine and the enforcement action and the thing. Obviously, don't quote me on that. This is not legal advice. Although you can read those books, particularly Investments Unlimited, I really like. This is a story about a company that gets hit with the enforcement action and then how they use DevOps and Agile practices in order to dig them out of that hole. And boy, is the hole very deep. I guess what I'm trying to say is that auditors are your friends. And the benefit of having auditors as your friend is that there are two types of auditors. There are internal auditors, there are external auditors. And they both are interested in seeing you succeed. And they both are full of good ideas of what the kind of things is that we need to look at. One of my first things that I did when I started a new role recently was to become friends with the people that look after all the regulation, to find out what are the important things, where can we push. I'm currently working in a Middle Eastern market where cloud is something that you occasionally see in the sky, not necessarily in public. Well, I don't know where I'm going with this metaphor. But the point is that, again, please don't quote me on this, Kuwaiti regulation says you can't use cloud, but a lot of Kuwaiti regulators will tell you, please do use cloud, particularly the ones in Northern Europe, because we really like GDPR, and that's good for people rather than the stuff that we've got in country. So there are a lot of conversations to be had before you go and sort of interpret that regulation yourself and then go, oh, we need to think of the worst case scenario and we can't ever store anything in the cloud, for example. And these make real big differences on how you do security, how you design your systems. It's collaboration. Auditors are your friend, remember that. The next piece of advice that I want to give, the sort of third piece of Agile, is customer collaboration over contract negotiation. If you've ever worked in a place where everything was decided by, but this is not in the contract, you know how bad this is. And it's the same in security. It's about working together. It's about finding what is the biggest fire that you need to put out. You know, should we add the WAF, a web application firewall, or should we document our policy to make a tick box with the auditor? Should we implement identity and access management, or should we just write it down that we haven't got one? It is always, and again, I'm sorry for using a really cliched thing, as everything in IT, so in AppSec, it depends. You need to make a judgment call. You need to talk to people to find out what the really important things are. You need to collaborate, be agile about it. Just recently, I've had a chat with my head of security, and there was something where, because we're sort of starting up and there's not a lot of process in place, he said, I don't have time to work on creating policies. There are just too many fires. But think about it. Policies, actually, when you think about it, are not something bad when you approach it the right way. Instead of saying collaboration over policies, maybe you should say collaboration on policies. And the way that I like to think about it is to say, if you write down what does good look like, and that's not a reference to me, it's a reference to that really nice bridge, which is my new favorite image for the paved road. You know, the Netflix paved road, the golden path, the guardrails. I was sitting in, this was in DevOps Days Amsterdam, and I was sitting in the cafe, and you had this view, and I thought, this must be where some Netflix engineer thought of the paved road, because you have like multiple guardrails, and if you go over them, you end up in the drink. The point that I'm trying to make is that when you think about sort of writing stuff down, what does good look like? You're kind of saying, this is what I expect people to do. And if I write it down, then it's much easier to give somebody a printout and, well, not a printout, obviously, a link to Confluence so they'll never find it. Repeating jokes, excellent. But by writing it down and defining what you think good looks like, people can actually read it and go, oh, okay, we'll try and do that. Rather than having to go and fight the fires yourselves, actually sort of having a little think of what good looks like. And that doesn't mean we prioritize policies and documents over actually doing the thing, but it's something to sort of think about. Security is a team sport, as I've said before. It is something that the security team can't do on its own. Now, I used rugby as an analogy. I don't mean Scrum. Personally, I don't like it, but it has its place. The last bit in my journey through the Agile Manifesto from an AppSec point of view is this idea of responding to change. I can't remember what the fourth point is. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is that instead of striving for perfect security, you really want to have the ability to respond to change. At the end of it, as a security person, you're here to help enable the business to create value. You're not here to create a secure system. You're here to help to make it as good as possible. Sometimes you do feel like that you're sitting in that cafe where everything's on fire around you. But you've got to start somewhere. You've got to invest your energy wisely. So to sort of come to the end of my little presentation, I do think that application security loves the Agile Manifesto because it makes sense on so many levels. You know, you don't want to be fixed on saying security is all about buying the right tools. Tools are just that. They're tools. They help you to do a job. Fundamentally, any software engineering, I've bastardized the 80-20 rule here. Software engineering is 80% social and 20% technical. The amount of time that we spend talking about problems far outweighs the amount of time we sit in front of the keyboard, which is also why all this Gen AI will replace programmers is bollocks. I do really like the basic principles about using Agile, and you can extend that. And that's why I think it makes sense to do it for application security. So I'd like to end with a call to arms, people over process, and yeah, maybe, I mean, you just need good identity and access management. But no. I hope you've enjoyed this little journey through my sort of experience with application security, how I found that using Agile principles actually makes a lot of sense and makes a lot of things easier. If you've got any questions, please ask them now or find me at your leisure. Yes?
One thing I noticed is you talked quite a few times about a security team.
Yes.
As opposed to, say, a security person working in each team.
Right. So the question is, the question is, just for so that everybody can hear, I mentioned a lot of time a security team rather than a security person in every team. And when you think about it, it is a question of scale. When you have, say you have 100 teams, do you really have the money to hire 100 security people, one for each team? It's kind of like the same thing as with DBAs. You need some sort of DBA knowledge, but is it really scalable to say that you have to have a DBA sat in every team? Now, so you can do two things, and I think they complement each other. You can have people that specialize a bit in security. Say, if you have a security champion program, so that there is one security champion in every team. Security champions, unfortunately, are quite a hard thing to get right because it usually starts out with everybody's enthusiastic, you have 3 meetings, and then you cancel 2. And then you cancel another one. And before you know it, you've spent 6 months without any sort of thing on a security champion. Security champions need actively people to sort of push out stuff. It's not something that sort of can sustain itself. If it works, it's a thing of beauty because you do want to, cliche alert, shift security left. You want that knowledge to be embedded. The reason I say security team, because I think there are some things that make sense to sort of deal with centrally. You want somebody to curate some of the vulnerabilities. If your organization has got a set of guardrails around your tech stack, then it becomes easier, I think, for a central team to work out what is the most secure way to do things. But yeah, I mean, if you're only a small organization and you've got 2 teams, then it may well be that you want to sit 2 security people in your 2 teams. Question is one of sort of, you know, can you hire for that role? Because I do think it does need a bit more than somebody who's just interested in security, because it becomes keeping up with all the vulnerabilities that come out, all the different tooling, all the different techniques, becomes quite a full-time job. Does that answer your question?
Yes. It's just that, there's something talking about getting security to be in that person.
Yes, it would be. If money is no object, you stick a security person, a DBA person, a lawyer, a regulator, all this. At some point, you're going to have to compartmentalize in order to sort of...
and one more question.
Yes.
In one of your slides, I think you said auditors love Agile, they like Agile.
Yes.
What is it about Agile they like?
It's a realization that software isn't a static thing. It changes, and that it has to change. Now, one of the books that I mentioned goes into it a bit more. I think it's the Beyond Agile Auditing. But it is something that I've been hearing again and again. I think was it last year, this year, at what used to be called the Enterprise, or what you call the DevOps Enterprise Summit. One of the things was the auditors are coming. And there were lots of talks from people who sort of like, yes, we do really want to do those DevOps systems, because manually inspecting documentation and proving that things work or don't doesn't scale. And auditors don't want to be sort of sat there and say, right, service number 558, are you doing this? Are you doing the next thing? Which is why you want to have tooling around it that sort of proves to you, as part of your delivery pipeline, I can say, this happened, this happened, this happened. And that's why I think it becomes a lot more important to do that. And I think that's been recognized in the auditing community.
Thank you very much, Gerald.